Since you did a cross-sectional study, you have more muddy or less clear evidence for extroversion changing across those two ages. And in a cross-sectional study, cohort effects are also a problem, because when you compare separate groups of people that are widely different in age, you're also comparing people who came from different generations. So roughly every 15 or 20 years, a new generation will appear. So first we had Generation X, then we had Generation Y, and now we have Generation Z. And those three generations tend to have characteristics that define them. So if you did a study and you gave a survey to a group of people from Generation X, another group from Generation Y, and a third group from Generation Z, you might notice some differences between your three groups simply because of them being from different generations. Those differences would be called cohort effects. So in a cross-sectional study, a cohort effect is a generational difference between participants. So a cohort effect is a difference that occurs simply because of the groups being from different generations. So let's imagine that your group of people, your group of participants who belong to Generation X, say that they prefer one type of music. Your group from Generation Y says that they prefer a different type of music, and your group from Generation Z says that they prefer another type of music. That difference in musical taste would be a cohort effect across your groups of participants. Or if your group from Generation X tells you that they don't use very much social media, and your groups of Generation Y and Generation Z both tell you that they do use a lot of social media, that difference in social media use would be another cohort effect, because in that case, your groups of participants are different from each other because they're from different generations. So there's a variety of different cohort effects that could be seen in a cross-sectional study. You can find cohort effects in technology use, in musical taste, in political beliefs, or a variety of other things. So the existence of cohort effects is a problem because when you observe a difference between your groups of participants in a cross-sectional study, it's not always clear if it's a cohort effect or if it's a developmental change that happened across time. In certain cases, it could be one or the other. So let's say in your study, the people from Generation X tend to say that they're less satisfied with their jobs, and the group from Generation Y says that they're more satisfied with their jobs. That could mean that job satisfaction changes across the lifespan from one age to the next. It could mean that as people get older, they tend to be less satisfied with their jobs. But it could just be a difference between Generation X and Generation Y. It could just be that Gen Xers tend to be less satisfied, and people from Gen Y tend to be more satisfied on average. You don't know if it's a cohort effect. You don't know if that difference in job satisfaction is a cohort effect, or if it's to aging across the lifespan, or moving from one age to the next. So let's now talk about the advantages and disadvantages of cross-sequential studies. So one main advantage of a cross-sequential study is the researcher can look at developmental changes and cohort effects within the same study. Because a researcher can do this because a cross-sequential study is halfway longitudinal and halfway cross-sectional, like I said. So let's look at a diagram, and you'll see what I mean. Let's go back to this diagram of a cross-sequential study. So here we're following two groups of people from across 10 years, and we're surveying each group 2 times. In this study, I could compare group 1 and group 2 at a single point in time, like at time 1 or at time 2, and that would show some individual differences between the two groups and possibly cohort effects, if any exist. And when I follow one group from one time to the next time, I'm going to get some evidence for, well, I'm probably going to get at least some evidence for developmental change. So when I compare horizontally, I can detect cohort effects, if any exist. And when I compare vertically, I can observe developmental change, if any change is happening. That's my main point. So you have, so a cross-sequential study really has the best of both worlds. It has the power of a longitudinal study along with the power of a cross-sectional study. So let's talk about the other advantages of a cross-sequential study. Well, it takes less time than a longitudinal study because you don't have to have as many time points. So let's look back at this example back here, this diagram. Notice how I'm getting data from 3 different ages, but I only need 2 time points, time 1 and time 2. If this was a longitudinal study, I would need 3 time points, one for 20, one for 30, and one for 40, and the entire study would be 20 years instead of just 10 years. So it takes less time than a longitudinal study. A cross-sequential study also requires fewer participants than a cross-sectional study because you don't have to have a separate group for every age you're comparing. But one major disadvantage of a cross-sequential study is that the results are complex and difficult to interpret. So in a cross-sequential study, you're looking at changes across time, and you're also looking at individual differences.